Hello, and welcome to a special edition of Up Close on METV. I'm Charles Clapsaddle, station manager for Manatee Educational Television, and it's our privilege to have with us today Mr. TDAllman, author of Finding Florida, the true story of the Sunshine State, among other things. Mr. Allman, TD, if I may, welcome.
I get interviewed by a lot of people, but no one before named Clapsaddle. I think I will remember you, and it is a joy and a pleasure to be here at METV. Thank you for having me.
It's our privilege to have you. When we found out about your availability here, we welcomed the opportunity because this book, as well as your other books, is a very important book, I think, for the state of Florida. It really traces the history of Florida in a way that really hasn't been done before.
You took the words right out of my mouth. When I, excuse me, when I started writing this book, I had no idea what a recent headline about me in the book said, that the history of Florida was thoroughly corrupt. It's all lies. There's a wonderful reporter in Miami named Jim DeFede, and he is about 4 times my size. And he came to one of the meetings one time, and he said, all I'm going to say is it's a great book. And as TD points out, it's all lies. And, you know, this raises many questions, but let me just give you one example. Ponce de Leon was not an old man. He was not searching for a fountain of youth. Let us imagine he was searching for gold. And of course, Florida is the only state with no metals of any kind. No gold, no tin, no lead. And that didn't stop them saying, where's the gold, where's the gold? But I often wonder why previous historians have not played a little thought scenario through their mind. What if Ponce de Leon had actually returned to the court in Spain, carrying these little vials of what he claimed was the elixir of immortality? He would have been handed over to the Inquisition for witchcraft. I mean, the Spanish would have been aghast, and the tale of the Fountain of Youth basically was churned up by Washington Irving in the 19th century and then picked up by generations of schoolboys. And then in the 1920s, a tourist promoter named Walter B. Frazier created the Fountain of Youth. And yet, I was in Tallahassee recently, and they have a marvelous history museum there. Mm-hmm. But they had an exhibit on the non-event of the non-discovery of Florida, which appeared on maps 10 years before its supposed discovery. And they had all the stuff about the Fountain of Youth there. And I won't name the professor from the Tampa Bay area who did this, but I mean, why do they keep perpetuating these myths? You know, the reality is the world around us, both the past and the present, is so much more fascinating than these fairy tales and these comic book versions that I just found myself engrossed in it.
Well, the thoroughness of your research into Florida, I mean, tracing it through the Ponce de Leon, to the Seminoles, through the Civil War, through the slavery days, up to the thing, is rich with actual specific history that is validated history.
I mean, and then these wonderful figures that have been really airbrushed out of history. I was in Tallahassee a week or so ago. I seem to be the only person since the 16th century who speaks fluent French and has written 2 books on Florida. And so there wasn't a lot of competition to be the keynote speaker at this colloquium on France and Florida, which was very, very interesting. And then the history department had me to talk to them, to the doctorals and postdoc and the professors. And the title of the talk was, they chose the title among several I suggested, and it was History versus Historiography, the struggle to reclaim Florida's past. So we have these people here, and I said, do any of you know who James Dean was, not the actor? How many of you know who William Powell was, not the actor? How many people do you know who John Titcomb Sprague was? And I went down the list, and not one of these could raise their hand. Now, I said, I'm no better than you. I had never heard of these people until I started researching this book. Let's just talk with William Powell, Billy Powell Jr. He was Osceola.
That's right, and that was something that when I went through your material, I found fascinating because he recreated himself basically as the Seminole chief, but his given name was
William Powell Jr. His father was a white man from Georgia. His mother was a mixed-race woman from what is now Tuskegee, Alabama, mixed Scotch and Indian descent. They were part of the McQueen clan, which was a powerful clan around what is now Tuskegee, Alabama. They were important enough that the McQueen family was mentioned in dispatches to President Thomas Jefferson. These are good, solid, important people. And then in comes Andrew Jackson with his ethnic cleansing, and I refer to it as ethnic cleansing throughout the book because that's what happened in the Southeast and many other areas.
And you know, in the book too, I mean, it's you know, the part of what we read was, I mean, Jackson, you know, came in with this preconceived notion that he was going to set up this little independent type of thing where slave-driven little empires.
Right. Well, what happens to everybody when they come to Florida, I call it the Play-Doh state. You come in, you mold the dough, and you make it into what you want, and then you watch as it oozes back. And when people ask me, what is the real Florida? I say, well, go to any of our state parks, for instance, and see what it's really like. Or even coming into this television station, there's some land over right beside it that has been untouched. And most of what we think of Florida was made up, I mean, dredged up, formed, conjured into Play-Doh reality over the last 50 years, 50, 60 years. And even without the question of climate change and so on, Florida would naturally, most of it, resubside into muck without continuing efforts to keep it the way it is. So anyway.
But anyway, I find this all as fascinating. I want to go into details more about the book.
You're so trustworthy. I feel if I go off on one of these tangents, I can.
But I'll bring you back. I'll bring you back to it. But one of the things that you know I'd like for our audience and for the people who are watching to understand is that you know you have a really rich and I'll use the word illustrious path. Mm-hmm. You know you're the author of many books, several books, and I want to talk about some of those. But also as a journalist. You worked for Vanity Fair for many, many years.
Mm-hmm.
And
Harper's, the New York Times, Washington Post.
And the Washington Post. You traveled all over the world. You covered great stories. So let's talk a little bit about TDAllman for a minute. And you know, you were a Harvard graduate.
Would you like to know when I became a writer and how?
I would love that.
It happened right here in the state of Florida where I was born and not too far from here. It happened just off Nebraska Avenue, near where Nebraska Avenue traverses the Hillsborough River in Tampa. I was 7 years old. My parents had a house, 1206 Park Circle. It was the first, you know, they say memorize this so if you get lost, somebody can take you home. And I remember walking home, getting off the school bus and walking down the street, carrying my book bag and my lunch pail. And I said to myself, I can write better books than this. And you know something, I was right because they were the Dick and Jane books.
Yeah, See Dick Run, See Spot Run.
And all that stuff. And that's when I became a writer, and I've been a writer ever since. It's taken different forms over the decades. But I was being interviewed by somebody else recently, and as a result of that interview, I made a connection, which I had not made until just a few weeks ago. It isn't just Dick and Jane and that stupid prose that I took on, which has turned out to be my life's work, as a matter of fact. There's another revelation, which I hadn't thought of until this morning. It's the whole idea of Dick and Jane and being blonde and blue-eyed and living on the hill and having a dog named Spot. I actually have a cousin named TDAllman, and he is married to a girl named Jane. They do live on a hill, but they do not have a little dog named Spot. But
not everybody has that idyllic
and
pastoral life.
I had this intuitive sense at the age of 7 that the world was deeper, richer, more complicated than what I was being told. And you know what? That's certainly turned out to be true wherever I've gone.
And I think in your writing and in your books, I mean, you certainly illustrate that with great depth and insight. So as you left Tampa and you became, you went away from the state of Florida to school.
Mean, just a little bit about my background. I especially when, shall we say, some people who are a little too wedded with the fake Confederate chivalry idea sort of accuse me of being an outside agitator. After telling them that if they think slavery was so sweet, they should experience it for 2 days, I hold up my Florida birth certificate and I say, where were you born? It's usually some other state, of course. But leaving that aside, my parents, I'm sort of reverse Sun Belt. I was born in the Sun Belt. My parents were both from Massachusetts. Mother was born in Boston, father was from Lawrence. And mother shot an alligator on the back lawn in Tampa one time. And another one of my early memories is of, you know, how when you go to the beach, it was clear water. You have the little bit there, and then it gets deep, and then you have a sandbar. And I remember my father carrying me out to the sandbar in front of the Don Cesar Hotel. But leaving that aside, he was an officer in the Coast Guard, which is why I was born here. And at, I think, the age of 8, we moved to Pennsylvania. And that's where I grew up. And then I went to Harvard. And then I went into the Peace Corps and became, as you call it, an illustrious foreign correspondent. And things finally circled back to Florida in 1980 when suddenly Miami was in all the news. I had actually never been to Miami before that. I'd been...
And then Miami was quite the mecca in the 80s.
Yeah, well, what happened was, as you may recall, as most people recall of a certain age, in 1980, Miami was absolutely buffeted by these human hurricanes. The Marielitos, refugees came from Cuba, many but not all of whom had criminal or at least rowdy past. There were civil disturbances in Miami's black neighborhoods. It's always forgotten the reason for those, which was a jury had refused to convict policemen of brutalizing a black middle-class insurance official, businessman. And by the way, as long as we're on that, you know, one of the things that runs through history in Florida is the triple nature, the unjust legal system in this state. And I started this tour in Jacksonville, actually Lake City and Olustee, but I was in Jacksonville when the latest verdict, the Dunn verdict, came down. And it was on National Public Radio, not a Tea Party station. And there was the woman on, the guest on before me, was a young black professor from the University of North Florida. She was impeccably groomed, both intellectually and in her appearance. And she never got angry. She never raised her voice. She was always spot on. And we started, first we heard from the trailer park racist. Well, you expect that even, but again, this is NPR, keep that in mind. Then came the gated community racist. And this woman who spoke with an educated accent like you or me, she said, well, why do they have to play their music so loud? Can't the police do something about that? And I watched in horror. Well, actually, nothing horrifies. I watched in dismay as this discussion of how a man literally had gotten away with killing a boy was metamorphosed into a discussion of how us white folks feel nervous when black youths play loud music. So it was my turn to come on next, and she, the very kind woman there, gave me the same. She also called me illustrious, or to that effect. I said, that's very nice, now let's get down to business. Today is a day of shame for Jacksonville, Florida, and the United States of America. These are the updates of the black codes, and I took it from there. And you know, why is history important? I had just come from Olustee. You can't understand the context that has led to an event like that unless you understand the history. There's one other thing I'd like to...
And I think that's a real telling comment, TD, if I may, is that there's undercurrents that have gone in Florida for generations. And those undercurrents bubble over into tragedies like the Trayvon Martin case or the Dunn case. But there is this I say the dark side of what happened and has happened throughout Florida history. And I think in your book, in Finding Florida, you really illustrate that. And you know, those who forget the past are doomed to repeat it.
Absolutely. One thing, and again, I learned long ago with my first book, which was called Unmanifest Destiny, that you only remember the bad reviews. The remarkable thing about both these books is the enormous success they have. And while initially described as controversial or troublesome, how quickly they became the standard. Not quite as quickly as people in Miami remember, but within a couple of years, this book had become the standard to the extent that it's now published by the University Press of Florida.
And I think that's the remarkable achievement. And I think, you know, we may have mentioned, is that, you know, both of these books are so important. You know, Miami, City of the Future, and Finding Florida, you know, from an educational point of view, that, you know, for schools or colleges, you know, so some people can understand the context
I feel very strongly about that, and I only cough when I'm on camera, so nobody in the audience should be worried about my health. But what I find out is if you don't have a context, you don't understand what's going on. Speaking of that, of reaching out, one thing I'd like to say is why I'm in Sarasota, why I'm in your studio right now, and how you constantly must not barricade yourself. I was first here just under a year ago when this came out in hardcover. It's amazing. It's gone through 3 printing and now it's out in paperback. It often takes years, and sometimes that never happens. And I was at Barnes & Noble here. They gave a very nice reception for it, a lot of people. And there was a very large white Sarasota crowd. I thought the older people were probably had been friends of my parents, and the guys dated my sister or something. And in the midst of this was a tall black man in an orange jumpsuit. And I will tell his name because he's why I'm here. His name is James McLeod. And he came up and he bought 3 copies of that book in hardcover, about $90. And I said, why are you buying these books? Thank you. He said, well, one is for me, one is for my brother, one's for my other brother. And then he looked at me. He's very tall, and I'm sitting, he looks down. He said, how do we make this the history of Florida? I said, I don't know, but I'm certainly going to try my best. And so it came time to do another book tour for the paperback. And I kept his card, and I called him. And so I'm very happy here in Sarasota. I know you put up a graphic, and not to go into
you have some signings that are coming up,
on Saturday. So that's tomorrow. I know we're going to. Those of you who are listening to it afterwards can ignore this. I will be at Bookstore 1 in downtown Sarasota on Main Street, that lovely bookstore. I will try and stop by at Barnes & Noble and sign some books. I'm sure they have them in stock.
We're putting all that information up on the screen.
But I'm going to the Fogartyville Community Center, which Mr. McLeod has connected me with, and I'm thrilled about that. You know, I find it is hard, but one of the things I've found traveling around the United States, and especially in Florida, and especially in northern Florida, we are much less deeply divided than the politicians, the newspapers, and the cable network news make it seem. I attended, well, we could do a half-hour comedy hour on my visit to the Confederate celebration.
I'd love to hear about that.
But, you know, I saw old guys in Confederate uniforms chatting amiably with black people. I think, you see, on the one hand, neither really understands what happened at Olustee, which kids, I think, in Florida are still taught, and the New York Times recently referred to as a major Confederate victory in Florida. It wasn't. It was Beauregard was disgusted with what happened at Olustee. He wrote to Jefferson Davis that the fruits of the battle were insignificant. Why? Because they paused to murder the valiant white and black, but mostly black, U.S. troops who had fought for our country that day rather than against. And yet there's no monument to these massacred patriots. We've spent hundreds of millions of dollars in Indochina, where I spent a great deal of time trying to find the remains of U.S. soldiers. We have done nothing in Olustee. And I think, let us say to our friends in the legislature, in Tallahassee, you who are so patriotic, and I certainly believe in your sincerity. We have the science now, we have the archaeology, we have the satellites. Why don't we take care of the Ulusty battlefield? Why don't we gather these remains of all the people who died there? We can identify them from their DNA, give them a respectful reinterment and a new monument.
And perhaps that time is long overdue.
I think it is, but I do say, you know, it's a very interesting thing. I'm coming to the end of this tour around Florida more optimistic than when I started, because I do find a sense of change. I mentioned the museum in Tallahassee, but the interesting thing about Tallahassee, they were very eager to have new exhibits, to include new people. I was in Orlando yesterday, and if you want to see the Florida, if you want to take the kids to see what I describe in this book, go to the Orange County Historical Center in downtown Orlando, and there's a very nice woman there, the directress, named Sarah Von Arsdale, I believe her name is, and she showed me around. It's wonderful, it's accurate, it's interactive, it's fascinating.
And I think that's one thing, that, you know, the key word that, you know, is really underlined in your books is accurate. The information that's in there is from your years of research and the depth of the research that you did. This generalized, romanticized history, perhaps, of Florida is something, you know, that needs to be, you know, kind of put on a shelf and looked at and examined and say, this is who we were, this is where we came from.
I would say it needs to be put in the compactor and then put out with the trash.
Well, one portion of your book, and I'd like for you to take a few minutes to talk about this, which I found kind of interesting, is the civil rights period in Florida. Many people think that the Deep South, that the Mississippis and the Georgias and the Carolinas were the hotbed of civil rights and the injustices that were done. But Florida was considered to be, and by many, to be as racist and as biased as any of those states. Is that correct?
Well, furthermore, Florida not only had Old South racism, it had North Gentile racism. I mean, as a child, I spent some time on Palm Beach, and I can't actually remember that. I do remember the colored water fountains. I went and drank out of the colored water fountains because nobody could tell me what to do. I had no sense of why one had this word colored on it, but it was like, well, you're not supposed to do that, and yet why shouldn't I? But you know, black people had to leave Palm Beach, and I believe Miami Beach for a while. And there are a couple of things. I suppose there's no point in taking down the book and putting
Absolutely.
it. Okay. Let me. We'll get to that in a second. But you know, the Florida has a distinctive state flag. And with the red cross. In the middle is the seal of Florida. Originally, the seal had mountains and the snow-capped mountains in the background, and the Seminole woman was dressed like out of a Hollywood movie. They did correct that. But do you know what that cross is on it?
Is it St. George's?
Well, it's a saltire, and that's from the battle flag of the Confederacy. And see, I say in the book that, you know, the legacy of racism in Florida is not as it is in like Alabama or Georgia, where they have had controversies over these state flags. It's like the Florida state flag. It's everywhere and nobody notices. And if I can find the pictures here, I want to show you a picture of a fellow. Okay, this fellow here,
hold it right up to that camera there.
All right, if you see this man here with the mustache,
Governor
Francis Fleming. He was governor of Florida for a while, but after he left office, he made it his life business to get that Confederate saltire, that cross, on the Florida flag, and he succeeded in eventually getting it passed, of course, by an all-white electorate. And it was done at that time with the full knowledge that that's why we're putting it on the flag. He wasn't sneaking it onto the flag. Now, this woman up here, do you know who she is?
Let me see.
The black woman there. That's Governor Fleming's niece.
Who was a black woman.
That's right. Her name was Lulu or Louise Fleming. He was Francis Fleming. So his father was one of the original settlers of Florida, and they always hold up the book. I was on Charlie Rose once, and I went in, and I was mortified. I put the book down like that.
Yeah, I always say, point the camera at the money. That's what they say.
So anyway, he grew up on this plantation. His father was first married to a Scotswoman, or a woman of the British Isles. She died. He next married a Cuban woman, and so he had several Latino half-siblings. And meanwhile, he had his black paramour, by which he had a daughter. And the daughter of that daughter was the woman whose picture you saw. So they are all living together. They are all living a lie together. And when you think of the horror of it, the official title of the black mistress was personal maid to the wife. And, you know, we have these things, selling your brother down the river. Where does that come from? So what do? You have this genteel young black girl who's raised in these elite surroundings with all the different lies and pretenses. So they send her off, and she gets a very good nursing education in North Carolina or someplace. Meanwhile, thanks in part to Governor Fleming and our other Florida statesmen's refusal to fund any kind of public health, and let alone a medical school, good heavens. Do you know we were sending doctors out of state to be trained in Louisiana until the 1960s because Florida would not bother to have a medical school. She is, you know, and so these epidemics are breaking out, yellow fever and so on. She is one of the few women in Florida, let alone black women, who has a good, strong professional medical training. So what do they do with her? They send her to the Congo. She gets to the Congo 2 years before Conrad arrives to write The Heart of Darkness.
Right.
And she has this wonderful Victorian innocence. Oh, the palm trees and the people here remind me of the climate of my beloved Florida. The poor woman, she gets sleeping sickness. She is taken back to North Carolina where she dies. Now, you think the reality has not changed. You see, today, that politician would be flaunting the diversity of his family, the rainbow coalition under his own roof, as, for example, Governor Bill de Blasio did recently, and you have...
And successfully.
And so, you see, it's not... Human nature does not change. Men, I think you and I both know what scoundrels men can be. And so the difference is the lies that people live, and then they try and impose them on other people.
And I think that's, you know, that's a very insightful, TD, of you.
Oh, I just want
because
to...
that kind of generates through the book, is that the lies kind of perpetrate on other lies, and then it becomes, you know, that type of history.
With the end result that, and I don't know where these 6-man juries came from. You should have 12 woman or person juries, but leaving that aside in Florida, it is, first of all, the stand your ground law is wrong, and a law which violates so many degrees of morality. A good jury will disregard the instructions of the judge and say, we will not convict. I mean, white juries did this all the time in Florida, and they're still doing it, as a matter of fact. But anyway, you get to this point where people are sitting in that jury, and I'm going to say, you're going to have, it's very hard in the state of Florida not to have 2 or 3 white people on that jury, because they have no sense of the context we've been discussing, who really find it, they're just not going to convict a white man of killing a black boy. And this was true in 1820 and 1880 and 2020. In France and Europe, I was at a colloquium on this book. Can you imagine me carrying on for 3 hours in French? Boy, that actually it was fine, because you're not always sure exactly what you're saying. But
and they just nod approvingly.
Somebody said to me, "Were you surprised by the Trayvon Martin murder?" I said, "No, it could have happened at any time. It could happen." I say, "But you know, just when you're ready to give up on America, it does something absolutely astonishing." I said, "What I never could have predicted when I started writing this book is that the state of Florida would give its electoral votes twice in a row to a black man." So all these funny things are going on all the time in America. And somebody said to me, somebody came to a thing in Jacksonville. He was he was certainly a gated community person. I don't know what epithet you'd put after that, but he and his neighbors are going to put up a statue to Senator Hugh Lee, who was an apostate Jew, who kept slaves, who rose in rebellion against the U.S. government, then came back and threw out little orphans from his house in Fernandina. And I said, and why do these people they suddenly seize upon Hugh Lee as their hero? And I said, people have asked us, should we take these down? I say, no, leave all these Confederate monuments around. Leave all these racist monuments around. Just tell us underneath what they actually did. And then we should add some other. So I said to the guy, I said, if you want to erect yet another monument to a traitor to his country who turned little orphans out onto the street, you go right ahead. But I said, what you might consider is putting up a monument to the hundreds of valiant black men from Fernandina Island who volunteered and fought for the U.S., for our country during the war. And by that time, another man was vigorously arguing with him. So I said, I'll leave that to you two to sort out. So it was.
And I think that's that's a critical thing that you bring up, and I highly recommend for people to pick up a copy of your book, or books really, in Miami City of the Future, and as well as Finding Florida. Mm-hmm. But one of the things, TD, if I may, is that the research and the depth of the research that you did in acquiring this material and making it into this fascinating, rich tapestry.
Well, it's just what you do. I mean, we were talking about Vanity Fair and Tina Brown, who was a wonderful editor, and I was. I had 7 or 8 tumultuous years running around the world for them. I was in Moscow and saw Yeltsin. I was with Yasser Arafat on his plane for 40 hours. I was in Tiananmen Square and so on. And that when you take the shuttle between New York and Washington, they put these magazines out. And I was mentioning this to her one time. The problem with most of these magazines, it seemed to me, is, well, the articles weren't finished. They hadn't really been edited. And I didn't think, I've written for The New Yorker, for Vanity Fair, for Harper's, and I think a lot of the other magazines, it's not that there's something wrong with them, they're just not professional. And Tina said the same thing. We wouldn't work 20 hours just to get one page right because we were trying to prove something, or at least I wasn't. We did it because it was necessary to get it right, and that so much slop goes around. And I'm afraid, gosh, I mustn't start calling these old historians the purveyors of historical slop. I won't do that. Next thing you know, I'd be on TV.
That's an aside. That's an aside.
I'd be saying something. But again, it gets back to the point about Ponce de Leon. Let me give you an example of one other fellow. Have you ever heard of Zephaniah Kingsley? You may have.
Zephaniah Kingsley.
Okay, now, here the tidying up and the airbrushing goes both ways. He was born in the British Isles, but he was very American. He came to Florida, Spanish land grant. When he was in his early 40s, he went to Havana, and he fell in love with, bought, and brought back to Florida a person who turned out to be one hell of a woman, who became known as Anna Kingsley, and they lived openly in Amelia Island and up there in northeast Florida. And his great work was called A Treatise on Slavery. It took the official, and this is like the 1829. This is like Jackson is in the White House. Andrew Jackson, the ethnic cleanser, is in the White House, and the reason he sees slavery as a kind of 1 or 2 generation tutelage, like indentured servants. And then they get freed, and he did this with his own slaves. They were taught trades, they had nice houses, they were allowed at a very nominal fee to emancipate themselves. But the real reason he loved slavery, and why he called it A Treatise on Slavery, was because he believed correctly that slavery allowed the most easy opportunities for sexual intercourse between the white and black races. And why was he in favor of this? He said this was this pleasurable yet noble activity was the best way to get rid of race hatred. And he had a generation before Marx, he had a very astute class analysis of the situation. He said in the other southern states, and this is a very fraught and deep and true subject, you had the white elite, then you had black slaves and Indians, and then the role of the poor whites, which to this day, contrary to their own real interests, is to support the rich whites. I mean, this goes all the way through, and this is the great utility of racism. Under slavery in Florida, no more than 8% of all Floridians ever owned a slave. Only about 3 to 5% owned any significant number of slaves. So why would these boys march all the way to Pennsylvania to get killed? Racism, fear of black people. See, that's what makes, racism is the glue that holds it all together. Now,
and that kind of permeates through.
Now, what Kingsley understood is the real solution to this was to make love. And he saw these interracial couplings, of which he himself was the exemplar, producing a mixed race yeoman class populating the center of Florida, which would play the same role as the countrymen did in other states. And so he's writing to his fellow slave owners, to the Andrew Jacksons of his time, hey, I think what you should do is like marry a black woman and then your
have lots of children.
And then they can play this role in protecting your privileges. And of course he was absolutely right.
And that you can see.
Now find this, again, I don't want to get into specifics, but I said you get, first of all, most of this was removed from history because, of course, people were aghast. The people who get to write history books, I might add, often subsidized by the state of Florida, were aghast at this. But there's another side to this. Anna has now become somewhat known as a historical figure, as he has. But a recent book came out, and the interesting thing is, I don't want to deal with a specific book, but what they now say is that she was a princess from Madagascar, and that somehow he might have met her on a trip to Africa, and that she really was a descendant of African royalty.
So the romanticism.
Yeah, and you see, what does this say to the young women of the hardscrabble young women of all races?
It says that.
It says you got to be a princess if you're going to marry the prince, you know. And you know, I think this is appalling, and so. I don't know, this is a country that exalts equality, that exalts opportunity, and yet somehow there is this sort of intellectual horror on many levels when we're really right up against it.
And I think, you know, that's why I think that Finding Florida is such an important look. It's like looking behind the curtain. It's stripping away that romanticism, that fairy tale type of thing. It's a beautiful place, it's the Sunshine State, and everything is fine and dandy. But if you look behind that curtain, there are certainly things that are very, very deep and dark. And I think that brings a lot for people, not only who are just history buffs, but for people who are concerned about the course and the matter of which the state will continue to grow and prosper.
And, you know, one of the benefits of these interviews, I guess you could call them Socratic inquiries, to which a successful author is subjected, is that, now I've forgotten my point, well, let me go on to something else about Zephaniah Kingsley. And he said, he not only was proud of this, he said this was the way to get rid of race hatred. He exalted the products. He was not ashamed of the products of interracial union. And he had at least 5 sons with Anna. And he said, when conditions are ripe, the result are better formed, more intelligent, and so on. And I say in the book, you know, it's Zephaniah Kingsley's proven right. If you doubt Zephaniah Kingsley, go to any hot disco in South Beach and Miami or wherever you go here in this area, and you'll see these magnificent, stately, intelligent, affluent people who don't fit into any of our old stereotypes.
And I think that's that's an excellent point, because the old stereotypes are things that kind of perpetrated by those who are not as knowledgeable, not have the insight and the background that you have. Now, TD, we're kind of winding down a little bit. And
I remember what I wanted to say, and
Sure.
this is very important. Sometimes, basically, and I notice this even in the New York Times, I'm supposed to come to a happy ending here. I'm going to say to your audience, if you want a happy ending, make a happy ending for yourselves. I can't help you have a happy or even a rational ending until, as I wrote in the New York Times, people stop building their lives atop sinkholes. But I remember this subject came up, and I said, what really differentiates my work, in addition to its thoroughness and the praise it has received for its style
Absolutely.
and so on.
And I must mention just briefly,
Yes.
because it has received praise, and this was a finalist for the National Book Award in 2013, and a significant achievement by any standard. But you were saying?
Yes, I was saying I embrace the tragic nature of history. If you don't understand the tragic nature of history, you can't understand Florida, you can't understand America, and you can't understand yourself. And, beware of this industry of fake consolation. And, we have to face up to the world as it exists. Zephaniah Kingsley did. He saw the solution to racism, which is for us all to engage in love. Make love, not racism.
Make love, not
we
war,
haven't, I don't know how many seconds or minutes we have left, but we haven't talked much about the Sarasota, Bradenton, Tampa Bay area.
Which is, I think, important, and I think, being familiar with Sarasota, that Sarasota went through its own spate and continues to, have racism. I mean, the beaches in Siesta Key were segregated for years, and it wasn't up until they had marches and people were bussed in, that those beaches were open for black families to participate.
And going further back in history, all this story about Ponce de Leon never came anywhere near St. Augustine. And he came around, he touched further south, but then he came around and his probable landing place was Charlotte Harbor. And so he was here and he tried to form a settlement. And of course, he antagonized the Indians, and before you knew it, he was wounded and he died of sepsis. But I've not seen it, but I understand here in Bradenton, on the southern shore, would it be, of Tampa Bay, you have this DeSoto Memorial.
DeSoto Memorial?
Which is entirely fanciful. I mean, they never wore armor. DeSoto never discovered anything. Henry Flagler had a great line about, this railroad to nowhere and so on. He said, if it weren't for Florida, I'd have been a rich man. And that was true of DeSoto, who's one of the richest men of the world when he arrived here. And what happened, all this stuff about the DeSoto route and everything, it was made up through a political process in the 1930s for 1939. New York was having the World's Fair, I think, that year, and Tampa wanted to get in the big leagues, so it declared the great celebration of DeSoto. And so all the President Roosevelt appointed Congress appointed a commission, and all the congressmen, of course, said, well, we want DeSoto to have landed in our district. And so the squiggle went around and around. Now, the real story of DeSoto is, today, I suppose he would have been diagnosed as manic depressive, or I don't know what it had been, or bipolar. But basically, he marched along. Where's the gold? Show me the gold. There is, of course, no gold. And he gradually went mad. And finally, I call him the Johnny Appleseed of pigs, because in the end, all he had were his pigs, who are the ancestors of the pigs who forage around Florida.
To this day.
To this day. And he may have seen the Mississippi, even that's not for sure, but he certainly didn't discover it in the sense. And one of his wonderful, again, all you have to do is go back and see what people actually said at the time. None of this is a secret. But he said, as for tracing the trail, and this was a guy writing in the 1600s, saying there was no way to know exactly where he went because all they were interested in was silver and gold. Hence, they took no notice of where they were going and took no trouble to mark the trail. Now, any historian who does the basic, like, what is the capital of Florida? Basic stuff would have known that, and yet here we go. We have the DeSoto trail with the markers.
And people, you know, flock to the DeSoto and Manatee County, and the surrounding areas are huge on the DeSoto celebrations and everything. Now, TD, it's most unfortunate, but
you mean we have to end?
We're going to have to end this thing.
Drat.
But I must say one thing, and this was fascinating, and I would welcome you back at any time, because not only do I want to hear about, more about your books, but there are other issues that you've examined not only as a journalist but as an author as well, that I think the audience should know about. And as we talked about briefly before, this is important to document, to archive, because it's important information that's relevant to a community and the people in the community, and not just, just for an educational and entertainment purpose. One of the questions I did want to ask you, when people read this, and I would encourage our audiences to pick up a copy of Finding Florida, The True History of the Sunshine State, and perhaps a copy of Miami, City of the Future as well.
It has a lot to do with everything.
But one of the key things that I want to ask you is, what do you want people to take away from your book about Finding Florida? What's that lasting value that, as they read your book, what is that issue that you want them to have as a lasting value?
A passion for the truth. We live in a society that's constantly purveying little fables to us. I mean, I see it right now. I mean, Putin has suddenly become this deformed figure because he's done something naughty, which we disagree with. But it's funny, when George Bush was going into Iraq, nobody did, well, some people did. But I try and stay off current events, other than, say, the Trayvon Martin style case, things that directly pinch. I would say a couple of things. Understand that life is difficult. Understand, especially if you are in Florida, this is not paradise. Here's what I want you to understand. Nothing can be improved or changed by moving someplace else. And Florida, more than anything else, going back to the Spanish, the slaveholders, the whites, the plutocrats, the millions of people who have come here, they have all basically come for the second chance, for the third chance, for the fifth chance. They think in Florida it's going to be different. And it's not different because we're not different, and also because Florida has no resources. But there's a quote I have at the beginning of the book, and comes from Horace, the Latin poet, who lived from 65 to around that period. He wrote this around 65 BC. Around 1,500 years later, the Frenchman Miguel de Montaigne wrote the thing that I am about to, that he quoted. And he was one of the first Europeans to understand the catastrophe which the European intrusion was having on the native peoples. And he was very important for that. But he also understood the folly of exporting our European quarrels and illusions and doctrines and schisms to the New World. And he wrote, he quoted Horace, who wrote, "Why do we flee to lands warmed by a foreign sun? What fugitive from his own land can flee from himself?" And nowhere, and especially not in Florida, can we flee from ourselves.
Well, TD, I think that's a very appropriate, and I think it's one of the most revealing quotes, because it really illustrates the depth and the intensity of Finding Florida. And I would highly recommend this to our audience.
Can I end with a question?
Absolutely.
The question Mr. McLeod asked. How do we make this the history of Florida?
And that's a good question, and I think that's a question that perhaps we can take up the next time when you come to visit, because we would welcome you back at any time.
Well, I'd be happy to come. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much for joining us, and thank you for joining us on this special edition of Up Close on METV. And please find out about Mr. Allman's other books, and specifically about Finding Florida, the true history of the Sunshine State. Thank you, and we'll see you next time on Up Close on METV.
Well.